It started on the downtown platform, 7:42 a.m., too early for panic, too late for anyone to care. A black man in a dark grey hoodie stood motionless, one hand gripping a pillar, the other shaking, slightly at first, then violently. He didn't scream, didn't gasp. He just dropped. No one caught him. A few phones came out. One man crouched down and said, "Hey, you good?" But Ellis didn't answer. Paramedics arrived 5 minutes later, vitals unstable. No visible trauma, no ID, just a folded piece of paper in his back pocket with 2 handwritten words. Left hand, always first. At 8:11 a.m. he was rolled into St. Lennox General. Room 409, no family, no phone, just tremors and a silent pulse monitor. Dr. Hawes entered at 8:19 a.m. Coffee in one hand, sarcasm in the other. Let me guess, low blood sugar, high drama. Probably skipped breakfast and remembered he has bills. The resident frowned. There's more. Twitching, intermittent verbal response, no signs of substance abuse. Hawes raised an eyebrow. So not a hangover? Well, at least that's original. He stood beside the bed, examining the patient without really looking at him. Young male, black, unconscious. We're either dealing with a seizure, a psychotic break, or bad choices. The nurse cleared her throat. Doctor. What? I'm just working with probabilities. But something didn't add up. The muscle tension in the forearms wasn't typical seizure residue. His pupils reacted, but asymmetrically. The tremors were rhythmic, almost intentional, almost coded. Hawes tapped the chart, lips pursed. Start with a tox screen EEG, full blood panel, and for fun, check if he has a podcast. I like hearing how I'm the problem. As he turned to leave, the patient stirred. Just a twitch at first. Then his lips parted. Don't guess. Hawes stopped, turned. Excuse me? The patient opened his eyes. Dark, sharp, focused. If you're going to assume I'm another statistic, at least get the math right. Hawes stared at him, silent. And for a brief moment the room wasn't filled with symptoms, it was filled with challenge. It wasn't the labs, it wasn't the vitals. It was the silence. The kind of silence that made Hawes suspicious, not curious, because most patients either moaned, begged, or panicked. But this one? He watched, eyes scanning, fingers twitching, breath measured. Dr. Hawes stood at the end of the bed, arms crossed, glancing over the initial reports that had come in. Blood works clean, no narcotics, no alcohol, no known allergens. Either this man is the healthiest unconscious person I've seen, or something's hiding. He didn't speak to the patient, he spoke around him, to his team, to the room, like Ellis was furniture that hadn't earned the right to move yet. Resident Malik chimed in, trying to sound objective. His neural responses are inconsistent. Speech centers are sluggish. Motor signals from the left hand are delayed. Hawes glanced up from the chart. Left hand, huh? That's funny. He had a note in his pocket that said, left hand, always first. He shrugged. Maybe he's psychic, or dramatic, or both. Ellis finally spoke. His voice was low, strained, but unshaken. Or maybe your framework's too narrow to see the variables. Malik blinked. The nurse froze mid-adjustment. Hawes turned his head slowly. I'm sorry. Was that sarcasm? Because I'm usually the only one allowed to do that here. Ellis didn't smile. No, it was logic. You should try it sometime. For the first time, Hawes looked at him, really looked. This wasn't a man clawing his way back from confusion. This was someone observing them, cataloguing reactions, memorizing pacing, matching tone. You have medical training? Is that a question or an accusation? It's a pattern. Patients who know more than they should are usually hiding something. Ellis exhaled slowly. Or maybe I've just had to explain things to doctors who stopped listening too soon. That hit, not hard enough to make Hawes flinch, but just enough to make him blink slower. He turned to his team. Run a brain MRI, look for microbleeds, any sign of autoimmune response, and add a full neurological screening. Malik raised an eyebrow. You think it's that serious? No, Hawes muttered, already walking toward the door. I think he's smarter than I gave him credit for, and that annoys me enough to want answers. Ellis watched him leave, not with resentment, but with disappointment. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that waits for proof. The MRI came back clean. No tumors, no bleeding, no swelling. Just an image of a brain doing something no one in the room could explain. Yet. Malik and the others laid out differential diagnoses across the whiteboard like a war map. Functional neurological disorder, early onset Parkinson's, psychogenic seizures. All possibilities. All unsatisfying. Dr. Hawes paced in front of the board, eyes darting between symptoms and timelines, like he was arguing with a ghost only he could see. He's responsive. He's alert. He's condescending, which means his cognition is intact. So why the tremors? Why the verbal lag? A nurse entered with the EEG results. Mild cortical misfiring. Nothing definitive. Hawes stopped, snapped his fingers once. Miss multiple sclerosis. Fits the tremors, the delays, the inconsistency. He's presenting like early onset relapsing remitting. Malik hesitated. But the imaging doesn't show demyelination. It's early. MS doesn't ask permission before it shows up. Start him on methylprednisolone. Let's buy time before his immune system buys him a wheelchair. They started the steroids. That night Ellis got worse. By morning he could barely hold a spoon. His speech was slurred. His eyes couldn't hold focus and his heart rate dropped below safe levels for an hour. When Hawes entered the room, Ellis was staring at the ceiling like it had disappointed him personally. You gave me something, didn't you? Hawes didn't answer. Ellis coughed. The treatment, it made this worse. Malik stood nearby, uncomfortable, shifting on his feet. Ellis turned to him instead. Which one of you guessed MS? Was it a coin flip or a stereotype? Hawes finally spoke. MS fit the symptoms. No, it fit your expectations. Silence. You saw a black man with tremors and assumed degeneration. You never asked what I studied. You never asked what I do. You just filled in the blanks with fear. Hawes didn't respond, not because he didn't have a comeback, but because for the first time he wasn't sure if he deserved one. The room was colder than usual. Maybe it was the AC, maybe it was the silence. Ellis lay in bed, his face pale, his fingers curled tightly around the sheets, not from pain, but from frustration. He knew what was happening. His body was betraying him. But worse, someone else had pulled the trigger. At 7:04 a.m., Nurse Nina entered with his personal items, a folded shirt, a wallet, and a slim black leather card holder. As she organized them on the side table, a small silver-edged business card fell out. She glanced at it, then paused. Dr. Ellis J. Grant, Cognitive Neurophysiology, MIT Guest Lecturer, .NIH Fellow, Neuroscience Division, .PhD, University of Chicago. She blinked twice, then walked out of the room. 10 minutes later, the card was in Dr. Camden's hands. Guys, we misread the entire case. Dr. Forrest took the card, scanned it slowly, then looked up with something between disappointment and restrained fury. He's not just some smart guy. He's a neuroscientist. He knows more about his symptoms than any of us. Chase, seated by the lightboard, sighed. So we diagnosed a neurologist with MS incorrectly. That's a whole new flavor of humiliation. The door burst open. Dr. Hawes stepped in. Coffee, chart, shrug. Don't tell me you're all mourning the loss of his anonymity. Camden stepped forward, card in hand. His name is Dr. Ellis Grant. He lectures at MIT. You called him a street case. Hawes didn't flinch. Credentials don't erase tremors. Forrest stepped up. His voice was low but sharp. No, but they should have erased your assumptions. The room froze. Even Chase stopped fidgeting. Forrest continued. You walked into that room, saw a black man with no ID, and filled in the rest with whatever narrative fits your comfort zone. Not your data, your comfort. Hawes narrowed his eyes. I don't see race. I see symptoms. Forrest laughed once, dry, bitter. That's the problem. You don't see it, so you think it's not there. You think not acknowledging it makes you objective, but it makes you blind. Camden spoke now, softly but firmly. We didn't just misdiagnose his body. We disrespected his mind. Hawes looked at the board, then the chart, then the card. He didn't respond, but the quiet was louder than anything he could have said. Later that day, Hawes sat alone in the conference room watching Ellis's brain scans again. Same data, same markers, same symptoms, but now he saw something he hadn't before. His own fingerprints on the misfire. Ellis sat up straighter in his bed, though his hands still shook slightly. The steroids had worn off, the fog in his mind had lifted, but what he saw around him was somehow heavier than before. The door opened. Dr. Hawes walked in. No team, no clipboard. Just a man walking into a room where he no longer controlled the narrative. He didn't speak at first. Ellis watched him the way someone watches a puzzle that's already been solved. No more guesses, just confirmation. Hawes sat down at the foot of the bed. "How's the left hand?" Ellis gave him a tight smile. "Still twitchy, but at least now I know it's not psychosomatic laziness. A beat." That was sarcasm, by the way. Figured I'd try your language. Hawes exhaled through his nose. "We started with incomplete data." "No," Ellis interrupted. "You started with a complete assumption." Silence. "You didn't misdiagnose me, Dr. Hawes. You misread me." He leaned forward slightly. "From the minute I came in here, I saw the checklist form in your head. Black male, no ID, collapsed in public." He paused. And that was enough. Hawes shifted in his seat. The symptoms pointed to MS. It was a logical choice. It was a convenient choice. Ellis's voice was low but razor-sharp. "And the treatment you gave me. It almost cost me my ability to speak. You could have silenced my brain forever, and still slept fine because I didn't fit your idea of someone worth a second opinion." Hawes didn't argue, because everything Ellis said, he had already thought in pieces, in private, just never out loud, never like this. Ellis leaned back. "You know, the irony is that I've studied neural bias for 7 years, watched how trained minds still default to race, class, language, clothing." He looked at Hawes. "But it's different when it's your brain. When the signal doesn't get through because someone cut the wire on purpose." Hawes stared at the floor, then spoke barely above a whisper. "We'll fix it, all of it." Ellis nodded once. "Start with the wiring, Doctor." The office was dimly lit. The fluorescent buzz softened by the absence of voices. Dr. Hawes stood in front of the diagnostics board, arms crossed, shoulders tense, not with arrogance but with a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Behind him, the room was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that demanded leadership, but the kind that suggested everyone was waiting for him to admit he didn't have an answer. Because this time, the question wasn't medical, it was moral. Dr. Camden entered first, gently, like she was approaching a wounded animal that might still bite. "You've been staring at that scan for 20 minutes. Hawes didn't turn. "That scan is lying." Camden raised an eyebrow. "No, that scan's just not telling you what you want to hear." A moment later, Dr. Forrest followed, file in hand, voice sharp but controlled. His cerebrospinal fluid just came in. Oligoclonal bands negative, so whatever's happening, it's not MS. Hawes finally spoke, eyes still on the board. "So the immune system isn't attacking the myelin, which means I attacked his neurons for no reason." Dr. Chase, now leaning in the corner, arms folded in that half-bored, half-bracing posture, muttered, "You're not the first doctor to screw up a case, but you might be the first to ignore a neuroscientist's own description of his symptoms because you didn't like how he looked delivering them." Camden shot him a glare, but Hawes didn't flinch. He was past flinching. "He told me it was the left hand. He literally gave me the diagnostic breadcrumb in a sentence, and I dismissed it because I assumed he was trying to impress me." Forrest stepped forward now, slower, more deliberate. "No, you dismissed it because he reminded you of every bias you haven't admitted to having, because deep down, some part of you believes black men lie or exaggerate or want sympathy, and when he didn't ask for it, when he spoke in your language better than you do, you punished him for it." The room didn't breathe for a second. Hawes finally looked away from the board and into nothing. He knew something was wrong, not just neurologically, intellectually. He used coded speech, pattern recall, semantic mapping. He was telling us where the lesion was. We just didn't want to hear it from someone who didn't match the picture we're used to trusting. Camden stepped closer. "So then hear him now, because the damage might still be reversible. If you're finally ready to listen." Hawes nodded once. Not a confident nod, not a victorious one, but the nod of someone finally agreeing with a truth that had been waiting, patient and persistent, just outside the echo chamber of his certainty. And for the first time in days, he picked up a marker. Not to prove anything, but to start over. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet you could mistake for peace, until you realized it was actually focus. Dr. Hawes stood in front of a blank whiteboard, for the first time without scribbles, without defiant arrows or sarcastic notes. He wasn't building a theory. He was listening to a memory. Left hand, always first. That line played over and over in his head, not because it was dramatic, but because it was too precise to be random. He turned to Dr. Camden. "Play back his intake interview." She hesitated, then tapped a few keys. Ellis's voice came through, slow, stuttering, but exact. First the left fingers. Then the left eye takes longer to adjust. Light feels heavier on that side. My speech doesn't slur. My pacing does. When I'm asked a question, the delay isn't retrieval. It's release. Camden leaned forward. "That's incredibly detailed." Chase, arms crossed, added, "It's almost like he was describing the neural path disruption in real time." Forrest spoke quietly, his gaze sharp. "He was. He's trained in it. He was mapping his own decline before we even took his vitals." Hawes wrote 2 words on the board: autoimmune encephalitis. Camden's eyes widened. "We didn't see any inflammation in the initial scans. Because we weren't looking for this. This doesn't show up like a tumor or a stroke. It lives in the silence between 2 misfiring synapses." He stepped closer to the board, thoughts bleeding through his voice. He described temporal dissociation, micro-hallucinations, synaptic lag, localized weakness, all symptoms consistent with limbic encephalitis or NMDA receptor-based inflammation. Chase frowned. "But wouldn't the EEG have shown a red flag?" "It did. We just ignored it, because the man saying it wasn't wearing a lab coat." Forrest, arms folded tightly now, asked the real question. "And if you're right, what's the damage?" Hawes paused, not from doubt, from knowing. "If we move fast, we reverse it. If we hesitate again, he loses his speech, cognition, motor control. And within months, we're watching a brain that once lectured at MIT forget how to blink." The team stood silent, because it wasn't the urgency that struck them. It was the clarity. And for the first time, Dr. Hawes didn't feel like he was solving a case. He felt like he was apologizing with science. The IV bag hung quietly beside Ellis's bed, the clear line carrying methylprednisolone and cautious hope through his veins. Outside the room, monitors blinked steadily, and nurses moved with the muted urgency of those who'd seen too many close calls and not enough confessions. Dr. Hawes stood at the doorway longer than he usually did, not because he was calculating, because for once, he didn't know what kind of doctor he'd be on the other side of that threshold. He finally stepped in. Ellis was awake, eyes slightly glassy from the meds, fingers steadier now, enough to type if he wanted, but his gaze was sharp again, and that made Hawes hesitate, just for a second. "Your inflammation markers are dropping. The treatment's working." He waited, no response, so he tried again. "We caught it early enough, you'll be all right." Still nothing. Ellis just blinked. And that silence, it wasn't passive. It was waiting. Finally, Hawes exhaled. Not a medical sigh, an emotional one. "I didn't trust you. That wasn't about medicine. That was about me." Ellis turned his head slightly. Not a challenge, an acknowledgement. "I've made a career out of ignoring noise, but I didn't realize some of that noise was me." He took a step closer. "You described your own condition more precisely than my whole team, and I buried it under an assumption I've repeated so many times. I stopped realizing it was a bias, not a diagnosis." Ellis finally spoke. His voice was slower but sharper than ever. "You're used to being right, that's your drug, but this time, your withdrawal symptoms are showing." Hawes let out a tight laugh. "Fair. No, accurate." Fad a pause. Then Ellis added, quieter now, "It wasn't just that you were wrong, it's that you thought I wasn't allowed to be right." Hawes didn't defend himself, didn't deflect. He just nodded. A small, silent human nod, the kind that admits failure not with shame, but with the intent to do better. As he turned to leave, Ellis said one last thing. "The brain remembers patterns, even the ones it shouldn't. Make sure the next time you see someone like me, you don't repeat yours." Outside the room, Dr. Camden was waiting. She raised an eyebrow. How'd it go? Hawes didn't answer right away, but his voice was different when he did. Better than I deserved. Ellis's chart looked better than Hawes expected. Steady heart rate, responsive pupils, speech returning with full clarity. The immune suppression had worked, but the man in the bed wasn't just healing. He was watching, and Hawes knew it. He stood outside the room again, not because of doubt this time, but because there was nothing medically urgent left to do. No stats to fix, no drug to administer, just a presence to account for. Inside, Ellis was sitting upright, reading a neuroscience journal. Of course, when Hawes stepped in, Ellis didn't look up right away. He waited, because people like him had learned to wait, not for help, but for recognition. I read your paper, Hawes said quietly, pulling a folded printout from his coat, the one on stimulus memory lag in multilingual brains. Ellis finally looked at him. You read it, or you scanned it for the parts you disagreed with? Hawes didn't flinch this time. I read it, because I had to know how much I ignored, before I pretended I didn't. Ellis set the journal aside. I wasn't angry you got the diagnosis wrong. I've seen smarter doctors miss subtler things. He leaned forward slightly, voice measured. I was angry because you didn't ask who I was. You just decided what I was. Hawes nodded. You're right, I let your body speak louder than your voice. A pause. And maybe that's the one test I never learned how to read. Ellis didn't soften, but something shifted. Not forgiveness, but that release. It's not about being seen, it's about not having to prove I deserve to be. He leaned back again. That's what healing really is, not the return of function, the absence of defense. Hawes took that in, fully. Then, as he reached for the door, Ellis said, Next time you meet a patient like me, don't come in with answers, a beat. Come in with questions, the good ones. Outside, the hallway felt brighter somehow, not because the lights had changed, but because Hawes had just a little, but just enough. Ellis didn't ask for a wheelchair. He walked slowly, not because he had to, but because leaving a place that almost silenced him deserved deliberate pacing. In his hand was a discharge folder. On his shoulder, a satchel full of medical notes he never needed help understanding, but on his face, not victory, not relief, something far rarer. Calm without permission. Dr. Camden walked beside him, holding the elevator door. Neuro told us your speech center should be fully stable in a few weeks. You'll need to rest, but everything's looking hopeful. Ellis smiled faintly. That's a word people don't use when I enter rooms. Nice to hear it on the way out. Camden didn't try to correct him, because some truths don't need balance, just acknowledgement. Down the hall, Dr. Forrest stood by the nurse's station, watching quietly. He nodded at Ellis. Ellis nodded back. No words. Just two black men in white spaces, exchanging a glance only they understood. As Ellis approached the lobby, he saw Hawes waiting by the exit. No stethoscope, no sarcasm, just hands in his pockets and eyes that didn't try to dominate the room. Ellis stopped a few steps away. Hawes cleared his throat, almost uncomfortably. We've added your case to our teaching files, not for the rarity, for the reminder. Ellis tilted his head. Which part? That the brain doesn't always warn you when it's failing, but sometimes neither does the system that's supposed to catch it. They stood for a moment, a beat too long to be professional, but just short of sentimental. Then Ellis reached into his bag, pulled out a small card. No name, just a single sentence. He handed it to Hawes. For your next diagnosis. Hawes read it. Ask who they are, before you guess what they are. Ellis walked out, not healed from everything, but whole enough to keep walking. Behind him, the hospital hummed back to life. And somewhere inside, a doctor stood a little quieter, a little slower, and a little more human. The blinds in Hawes's office were tilted halfway, just enough for the sunlight to scatter across the file on his desk, casting long grey shadows over the printed name. Grant, Ellis J. The file should have been closed, filed, forgotten, but it wasn't. Because this case didn't just get solved, it shifted something. Hawes sat behind the desk, not leaning back like usual, not with his feet up or a coffee in one hand and sarcasm in the other, just Still, he read the intake sheet again. 28-year-old black male, collapsed in subway, unknown history. 3 lines. That's all they had. And that's all he chose to see. Camden walked in, holding a new patient chart. She paused when she saw the grant file still open. "You okay?" He didn't look up. "Do you ever think about how fast we make decisions? Like, our brains leap to fill in blanks before we've even processed the question?" Camden nodded slowly. That's how bias works. It wears the face of instinct, but it lives in habit. Hawes finally met her eyes. "This whole week I kept telling myself we were just under pressure, fast case, vague symptoms, missing data. But the truth is I didn't want to ask the next question because I thought I already knew the answer." She set the new chart down. "You weren't the only one who missed it." "No," he said, voice low, "but I was the one who set the tone, and that makes me responsible." He turned the folder over, closed it slowly, then pulled a pen from his coat pocket. Not the red one he uses for writing prescriptions, not the blue one for notes, the black one, the one he uses when he signs off on final assessments. But this time he didn't sign off. He just wrote 5 words at the bottom of the last page. Diagnosed, survived, unheard, underestimated, seen, and then underlined 1, seen. Camden watched in silence. No validation, no absolution, just presence, because she knew. Some lessons don't need applause. They need repetition. In the hallway outside, Forrest passed by the glass wall he didn't enter, but he saw the file and he saw Hawes still staring at it, and that was enough. Because when the system doesn't apologize, the first quiet pause from someone who used to run it is the beginning of justice. The teaching amphitheater at St. Lennox General smelled like coffee, dry erase markers, and ambition. Rows of bright-eyed med students filled the room, half of them typing notes before the case was even introduced. Dr. Forrest stood at the front. No slides, no clever visuals, just a patient number and a name. Case study. Patient Grant, 28-year-old male. Initial symptoms: tremors, slowed speech, asymmetrical neurological response. Final diagnosis: autoimmune encephalitis. Final complication: misjudgment. A ripple of silence moved across the room, not confusion, but curiosity. Forrest began walking slowly across the front. The mistake wasn't missing the rare diagnosis, it was assuming the man didn't know what was wrong because of what he looked like, because he didn't show up in a lab coat, because he didn't announce his PhD. One student raised her hand. "But we're taught not to rely on patient input too much, to observe objectively." Forrest smiled, but it wasn't warm. "You want objectivity? Start by questioning your instincts, not the patient's." In the back row, seated slightly off to the side, Dr. Hawes watched quietly. No coat, no clipboard, just him, listening, not correcting, not guiding, just learning, in front of the very students who once tried to be him. Camden stood beside Forrest now, clicking a remote to display Ellis's own handwritten note on the projector screen, the 2 words, "Left hand." She turned to the room. "He told us everything, but we didn't listen, because he wasn't shouting." A beat? That's the mistake you won't read in textbooks. That's the one you have to feel. Some students wrote it down, others just stared. But for the first time in that room, no one asked about treatment protocols. They asked, how do we make sure we don't become the reason someone gets worse before they get better? Hawes didn't say anything on his way out, didn't stop by Forrest, didn't nod at Camden, but when he passed the final slide, the one that simply read, "The patient who diagnosed himself," he paused for half a second, and for someone like Hawes, that half second meant everything. That night, Hawes sat alone in his office. No charts, no diagnostics, just the low hum of the hallway outside and the faint echo of Ellis's voice still trapped somewhere between memory and regret. He picked up Ellis's discharge note one last time. "Ask who they are before you guess what they are. He didn't fold it, didn't file it. He pinned it to the bulletin board above his desk, next to anatomy diagrams, pharmacological guidelines, and one faded quote from Hippocrates. For the first time in years, his walls reflected something more than logic. They reflected awareness. Downstairs, another patient checked in, Different face, same form, and this time when the intake nurse asked Dr. Hawes if he wanted the chart first or the patient's background, he said, both, in that order. Because some cases don't just get solved, they change who you are before you even know you needed to change. And some patients, they come to be treated, but they end up treating the doctor. If it made you think about how quick we are to label and how slow we are to listen, then don't let it end here. Like this video to say, I see you. Subscribe for more stories that go beyond the surface, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever been misjudged before you had the chance to speak? Because at Black Canvas, we don't just tell stories, we uncover the ones that were never meant to be heard.